Good morning or afternoon to everybody, and as we like to say here at SafetyChain and Leavitt Partners, TGIFF, thank goodness it's FSMA Fridays. Our topic today is what do good environmental controls look like, and we'll be getting to our topic and our speakers in just a moment. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. If you are having technical issues at all today with the online version, if you're coming in online versus just joining us by audio, we are being hosted for this event by WebEx, and you can call their technical support line directly at 877-509-3239, and again, that's 877-509-3239. You'll receive an email by close of business Monday that will allow you to download the recording of today's event. We will be taking questions after the first part of our presentations today and our interviews. Those can be submitted online only. For your privacy, if you are online with us, you can see your name and the name of our producers and presentation team. You will not be able to see the names of the other attendees. And with that, let's move on today to introduce our speakers. I'm Barbara Levin with SafetyChain. I'll be your host today, conducting interviews with our Leavitt Partners FSMA Friday team. We've got joining us today Dr. David Acheson. We've got Jennifer McEntire with us today, as well as Sherod. You can see a little bit about them up here today, and they'll be first going through some questions that have been pre-submitted, and then when we're finished with those questions, we will take questions from the audience. And with that, we're just going to jump right in. And David, I'm going to start with you and ask you, as we do at the beginning of every FSMA Friday, before we jump into our topic, what's the latest and greatest from the FDA on FSMA?
Thanks, Barbara. Great to be with you as always, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. I really think I've got one update to share with everybody. For those who are tracking this interesting legal suit around timing of the FSMA regulations, as many of you be aware, the FDA was sued by consumer groups because their timing had slipped, and there was a lot of debate and dialogue, and FDA submitted suggested timelines that they felt they could meet, and the consumer groups submitted ones that they thought they should meet, and they were poles apart. And I think the latest update is that a judge has ruled somewhere in the middle. And the judge has been King Solomon and essentially split the baby, frankly. And what this means, if FDA follows through to the judge's orders, is we are going to see a lot of these new proposed rules coming out this year, particularly on the long-awaited foreign supply verifications, third-party audits, animals, the preventive controls for animal foods. And then pretty soon after, I think we'll see sanitary transport, and we'll see food defense, with the goal to getting final rules moved forward in pretty short order. So I think that's the main deal here, is a lot of pressure on FDA. One commentary from me on this is I'm curious as to what happens if FDA doesn't deliver. I'm not sure who's going to get fined, who's going to be popped into jail, as to whether in actual fact these orders have got teeth, but they are certainly they're certainly interesting to follow. So I think we'll see stuff moving either way. So I think that's my main update, Barbara. Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll come back to you a little later. Thank you, David. We're going to jump over to you, Ann, now. And first, welcome to the FSMA Friday team. This is your first FSMA Friday, and I'm sure it won't be your last. So with this topic, you know, I've asked quite a few people how they define environmental monitoring, and I've gotten quite a few different answers. So can you tell us what is it, and is it in itself, is it a preventive control which is going to need to be monitored and verified within a food safety plan, or is it a method to monitor the effectiveness of other preventive controls like sanitation?
Hi, Barbara. Thank you, and thank you for everyone for attending. As David said, this is a very loaded question, so Let me start first with the environmental monitoring program. We at Leavitt Partners believe it's a multifaceted program. It helps you understand your environment and the potential for any product contamination from that environment. It's not just your testing program. It can include elements such as sanitation, pest control, good manufacturing practices, good hygiene practices, and also to monitor that and verify that is your testing program. So looking at environmental monitoring as a preventative control, you have your product categories that you produce in your manufacturing facilities. If you have a public health organism that is found reasonably foreseeable with that particular product, and in your particular facility, it is reasonably likely to occur that it could contaminate your finished product, possibly you would have environmental control as a preventative control. On the flip side of that, for example, if you have Salmonella in peanuts, or you consider Listeria monocytogenes in a ready-to-eat prepared sandwich, those are reasonably foreseeable, but you could, in your facility, control it to not be reasonably likely to occur through sanitation, which would make it a method to monitor the effectiveness of your preventative control. Jennifer or David, do you have anything to add?
This is Jennifer. I would just add that, as Ann said, environmental monitoring can be defined differently. The programs that are in it, whether it's testing or more than testing. And so I think as we talk about environmental monitoring and as we go through some of the subsequent questions and look at how FDA is viewing this, it becomes a little bit clearer from the regulatory standpoint of what FDA is thinking and how they're viewing it. Well, I know we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay. Well, we're not going to let you off the hook here yet, Ann. I'm going to come back to you and ask, so when the FDA is talking about environmental monitoring, are they talking about testing for pathogens only? So what is environmental monitoring in the FDA's eyes? And if you're doing ATP tests, is that sufficient?
The FDA believes that monitoring for specific organisms of concern, such as Salmonella or Listeria, is of particular usefulness as a verification measure. And they have identified pathogens and indicator organisms, which are acceptable in these programs. For example, Listeria species is a great indicator organism for Listeria monocytogenes. They don't, however, identify anything in the preventative controls today as an indicator for Salmonella. If you are just doing ATP tests, is that sufficient? Well, that's a good question. I would say in some areas or some part of your program, possibly, it could be sufficient. But if you do have ready-to-eat foods that are post-processed exposed to your environment, most likely ATP is probably not sufficient, and you would want to be evaluating any organism of concern that could cross-contaminate your product in that environment and be monitoring for that, which would include pathogens.
Okay, interesting. Jennifer, let's jump back to you again. So, I think probably there's quite a few people joining us today who are asking the same question. So if it's this important, why didn't the FDA require it? And do you think that this could change in the final rule?
Sure. So first let's start with, could it change in the final rules? The answer is yes. Pretty much anything can change as we move toward the final rules. And this is an area where FDA is asking for specific comment and specific additional information about the value and the cost associated with doing environmental monitoring of the type that Ann described, which is looking for these specific pathogens, Salmonella and Listeria, as they apply, especially in the ready-to-eat facilities. Currently, FDA is not, in the proposed rule, requiring environmental monitoring for everybody across the board. And the reason for this is even if FDA wanted to, which it appears perhaps they did, when the proposed rule went through the Office of Management and Budget, who looks at the economic impact of these rules, it was determined that this would be very costly to the industry. And for that reason, a firm requirement for environmental monitoring was taken out of the proposed rule. So as it stands right now, no, it's not required for everybody under every circumstance. FDA has identified, as Ann said, those environmental pathogens, but hasn't gone so far as to say if you have these environmental pathogens reasonably likely to occur, you must do environmental monitoring. But all this can change, and I think that for facilities, this is an area that it's important to keep an eye on and to make comment on.
Okay. Continuing on then, Jennifer, with you, if you identify Listeria or Salmonella as a hazard that's reasonably likely to occur, what do you think environmental monitoring would be, or do you think environmental monitoring would be an appropriate part of the FSMA Ready Food Safety Plan?
I absolutely think that if you have, especially a ready-to-eat facility, you identify Listeria in a wet facility or Salmonella in a dry facility as a hazard that's reasonably likely to occur, you need to use sanitation preventive controls, especially of those product contact surfaces, looking at insanitary objects, the ability to cross-contaminate. I absolutely think that environmental monitoring for those pathogens is a component of that food safety plan to verify that sanitation that's occurring that should reduce or eliminate these pathogens, which we know can take residence in facilities. And in the case of ready-to-eat facilities, if they can come in contact with that product, that can present a human health concern. So yes, even though FDA may not be explicitly requiring it, I think if you're using sanitation as a preventive control at the product contact surface or for those objects that are touching products, my recommendation would be that environmental monitoring should be part of your food safety plan for that verification.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Let's come back to you for a moment. And what should you do if an inspector comes in and starts collecting environmental swabs?
Good question. What do you do in that situation? Well, a few questions you probably want to ask yourself is, why are they there? What are they going to do when they're there? If they do any testing, when will those results be available? And what would be my next steps? So when they come in, they can come in for a couple of reasons. They can come in just to gather information. They could come in for a routine inspection, or they could come in for cause. Let's say you had a recall or there was some customer complaints that came through. You also want to shadow them based on what your policy says for how you manage inspectors. And then if they take samples, you need to figure out if you're going to take them along with them. If they collect product samples, what are you going to do there too, whether you're going to collect samples before or after, if they will do a split sample program with you. In regard to sampling, you'll want to make sure that you hold any product that they may have samples, either environmental for food contact or for product samples, until you get those results. You would hate to put yourself in a situation to release that product and then have a potential recall if the results came back positive. After they do collect samples, you would want to know when those results are available. You could ask them what lab they're sending them to. You could also inquire about the methodology that they're using, which would give you a good indication of timing as well. And what are your next steps? It's just to wait. It's to wait to see what those results are. It's to wait to see if you get a verbal discussion from them, if you get anything written for a follow-up from them, and then you do according to your programs and your procedures and any corrective actions that you need, any appropriate response that is required by them, whether it's updating procedures or retraining of individuals. So those are some of the things that you can do if an inspector comes in and starts collecting swabs and taking samples from your facility.
Okay. Okay, David, let's come back to you if we can here before we open this up for questions from the audience. While we're addressing this to you, we're going to, for those of folks that are online, We're coming out of full screen, so you can start to put your questions together. To submit a question, simply go to the box that you should see now on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and you can enter and then hit send for your question. So while we're waiting for some questions to queue up, David, what's the bottom line? If the FDA is not requiring environmental monitoring, should companies do it?
Well, Barbara, I think let's just look at this. Number one, FDA has the authority to require it, as we've heard. I can absolutely assure everybody listening to this that the FDA wants to require it, and as Jennifer pointed out, that the Office of Management and Budget required that they took it out of some of the initial versions. Wouldn't shock me if it goes back in. So number one, bottom line is expect that in the final rule we might see some form of environmental monitoring as a requirement. So what should companies do? As we've heard, if you have a ready-to-eat product that is contamination with either Salmonella or Listeria is reasonably likely to occur, you've got to control that. Either way, whether FSMA says you should or you shouldn't, you've got to control it, which means sanitation. And frankly, how do you know your sanitation isn't working if you are not monitoring? So my view is that wherever FDA it goes with this, if you do a proper hazard analysis and you come to that conclusion, yes, you should do it, irrespective of where the regulators are to control your own risk. It's the smart thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. We're going to go now. Excuse me, I am having to questions from our audience. Let's see. We've got a question. Let's see, from Cindy. And let's see, Jennifer, I'm going to give this to you. I think, is it a good idea to stop and do a full sanitation after FDA leaves after they take samples?
That would be a prudent thing to do. And in fact, there are companies, if they're doing environmental testing, especially of the more sensitive areas of the facility, those Zone 1 facilities, they'll do sanitation, then testing, and then sanitation again to ensure that if there is a positive, at least they've done another round of sanitation. And so, yes, I think, and I would be interested in Anne's feedback on this as well, I think that if there is environmental monitoring that FDA is doing, especially if they're looking at those Zone 1 areas, that you do want to do a full cleanup again after they finish their sampling.
Okay, great, thank you. And Greg is saying, we know Listeria is ubiquitous. So if we find it in our environment, what is the impact?
Listeria in general, if you're monitoring for Listeria species, you could have Listeria monocytogenes, the pathogen present, or you might not. Yes, it is ubiquitous in the environment. You're going to bring it in on your pallets, and you're going to bring it in from your people. It is definitely found in the environment everywhere. Most companies react to Listeria species and do some form of corrective action. They have sanitation SOPs that would go after where it is, and they have continuous plans as well if they find a reoccurrent positive in that same area. So if it's found, you definitely want to react to it and make sure that you're documenting. And for the previous question as well, document that full sanitation and document the results of the verification of those activities. I think that's applicable to both of these questions.
You know, we have a question on that, and so I'm going to I'll come back to some of the others, but I've heard just about everybody on the Leavitt Partners team say that when it comes to anything FSMA, if it's not documented, you might as well not have done it. So Anne, maybe continue with you, and then maybe Jennifer, you can jump in as well. What should companies be doing for documentation? What needs to be documented?
In regard to an environmental program, you should, number one, just have a policy on how you manage it. Number two would be procedures. in specific areas of your facility that you follow, which could include all the way down to your laboratory execution procedures of testing. And then you want to have with each of those the appropriate documentation that you deem acceptable that follows date, time, responsibility, who's accountable for it, and then verification of those records is key as well. To make sure that if you've got something that is critical enough to be reviewed on a weekly basis that you've determined, or if it's part of a critical control point or part of a preventative control, that you need to have that record verified, you need to make sure that you're doing that in accordance to what your policy is. Anything else on that, Jennifer?
I would add, I guess, that when we're talking about environmental monitoring, one of the opportunities I think that exists is to look at trends. So although somebody may be generating these records on a regular basis, even reviewing, verifying these records on a regular basis, looking at the big picture is particularly important. Understanding where in the facility, what pieces of equipment perhaps more frequently come up positive, and really getting to the root cause of that issue. FDA is expecting to see that. If this is something that's part of your food safety plan, doing a Band-Aid fix is not sufficient. Looking for root cause and addressing the real issue is FDA's expectation, and it's incumbent on industry to go ahead and do that. There's also, I think, a question that we get about how long do you need to keep records. So currently environmental monitoring isn't proposed to be required by FDA, so it would be an optional or voluntary program unless it's written into your food safety plan. If it is part of your food safety plan, then the record-keeping requirements would be the same as the rest of the food safety plan, which is 2 years for those records and at least 6 months on-site. And on-site includes having access to electronic records.
Thank you. And we saw that we have another question on what period of records, so I think that you just addressed that. Question from Nancy that came in on my chat. David, maybe I'll start with you on this. For companies who aren't doing this formally but need to start, high level, what are some of the first steps that they should be taking?
I think like everything else, Barbara, step one is do a risk analysis. Look at your systems. Look at where your risks are coming in, essentially beginning from receiving through to shipping. If we take an example where you receive a raw product, you process it in some way, and you end up with a ready-to-eat product, and you ask yourself, is that ready-to-eat product area where I have got a risk of one of these bugs getting into the finished product that we've been talking about? Is it reasonably likely to occur? And if the answer to that is yes, look at how the bugs are going to get in there. What's the traffic flow? What's the ingredient or the product flow, the human flow, foot traffic, vehicular traffic, pallets? How are the bugs getting in there? Look at within this area that you've determined is important. Let's just say it's your ready-to-eat area. How am I going to control that risk through hygienic zoning or through traffic control systems, etc.? What's the general infrastructure of my facility? If Salmonella or Listeria is lurking in there, or they got places to hide? What's the quality of my walls, my floor, my equipment? Is it cleanable? Can I sanitize? All of these are important parts of sanitation and controlling risk. And then, as we've been discussing, once you start to put all that together and you've got a program in place, how do you know it's working? What's my monitoring program? Where do I sample? How often do I sample? As we've heard, trending it, writing it down. And effectively what you ultimately want to do here is play the detective. Play the, how is the bug going to get in? Where's it going to hang out? And how do I find it and destroy it? And there's a series of steps that you go through if you've got nothing in place where you can build up to a pretty robust program fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. While we have you, David, this question from Susan. Can you please provide the FDA's logic behind not recognizing enterobacteria testing as an indicator monitoring for Salmonella? Do you believe this can be changed with proper education? Good question.
That's an excellent question. I wouldn't profess to begin to try to opine on FDA's logic. I'd get myself in all sorts of bother. I'm not sure I know the answer. as to what their logic is on that. I don't know whether Jennifer or Anne have insights on that. They were pretty explicit, actually. Salmonella, you go look for it. But they did talk about Listeria species as an indicator for Listeria monocytogenes. I'd like to think they're educable on this, and maybe if they're, frankly, it's going to depend on robust science. Is the good science to indicate that Enterobacteriaceae is a good marker of Salmonella, and if that is the case, and I don't know that just off the top of my head. If that is the case, then I would absolutely recommend that this be submitted as a comment. If Susan thinks that this should be, she's got the science to back it up, and get it in there as a comment, because I think that would be a good thing to do. But maybe Jennifer or Anne have got some better insights as to what the agency's thinking was behind this.
Well, I can't profess to know what the agency's thinking was behind this. This is Jennifer, but it does, based on some of the science that I've seen, there are some products for which Enterobacteriaceae is not a particularly good indicator organism for Salmonella. And so I don't know if perhaps the agency is looking at making some general statements, looking at the breadth of the entire food industry and saying, well, if you're looking for Salmonella, just go with Salmonella, since EB is not always a perfect indicator in some circumstances. However, as David said, if there's the science to suggest that it does work, that there is a good correlation between the indicator and the pathogen that you're really targeting, then certainly submit that information. I think that FDA would be quite interested and open to receiving it.
And I think just to add to what Jennifer said, this is David, that these rules were not written for specific product categories. They were really meant to be across the board, cross-cutting. So if you get exceptions, Salmonella is good across the board. But if, as Jennifer said, there are somewhere where the Enterobacteriaceae is not such a good marker, then that's probably the logic behind the agency. And we might see some of this greater specificity coming in certain areas with regard to the guidance documents that will ultimately accompany the new rules. So I suspect that if one had to look for a logic stream, I think, Jennifer, you probably just identified it.
Great, thank you. I think that covered all of our questions. I'm going to give some information, then I'll take another quick look to see if we've missed any. Anyhow, we have just added FSMA Friday topics through the end of the year. You can see them on the schedule here. And as always, depending on what the FDA does, these topics are subject to change. If you are already registered, you don't need to re-register. If you have colleagues that you think would benefit from coming to FSMA Fridays, they can go to FSMAFridays.com and register. We've got some fabulous events coming up that you can register for all of these at SafetyChain.com. We follow all FSMA Fridays with a how-to series to show you how technology can help with your execution. The next one is on July 19th, and how to automate environmental control programs. We've got a great webinar coming up on lean principles for the food and beverage industry, ways to cut costs while actually improving safety and quality. And then we have our every other month demo day on August 15th. If you're coming to IASP, I hope you'll drop by and visit us at booth 415 to learn more on how Leavitt Partners can get you ready for FSMA compliance and how SafetyChain can help you with automation. Our websites are there. And I don't see any additional questions. So with that, wish everybody a great day. Thank you for joining us. Of course, to the Leavitt Partners team, thank you as always, and TGIFF, everybody.